Hey everybody, today we're looking at if you are an INFJ. We're going to go into some typing details. INFJs are often thought of as the least common type, but they're often the most commonly typed ones when it comes to the tests. So today we're just going to look at that discrepancy, figure out if you, yourself, are an INFJ. Let's get into it. Alright, so let's get into some details to kind of determine if you are an INFJ, if you're curious, if you've just been typed, if you think maybe there's a possibility. We'll go into some kind of different explanations about it. It's a complicated subject, obviously. It can't just be typed over this. It's a little bit too difficult. You're going to want to go to ontype.ca/advising to get typed, or read our handbook for free, which will give you a lot of information. But we'll start with some common INFJ traits. So if you're wondering if you're an INFJ, you can try to kind of see how much you kind of think you relate to these things, how much you kind of do these things, how you feel about it. We could do a different series for lots of the different types, but we'll start with just some common INFJ traits. So they're direct and responding types. So that means they're very, they don't say a lot of words. They're very quick to the point. They can be kind of witty with it. They can kind of say one or two things that are kind of meant to elicit a reaction. They're very intentional with what they're saying. They're going to make sure that when they say something, they mean what they say and they say what they mean. And it's going to be, they're going to try to say the truth very quickly. They're going to try to say their jokes very quickly. They're going to kind of express what they want very quickly. They're not going to say a lot. They're not going to give a lot of context. They're not going to dance around the point. They're not going to talk your ear off unless you know them really well. Obviously, it changes depending on comfort level. But for the most part, they're going to be quick to the point. They're not going to be opening up and sharing very much. They're going to be pretty direct and pretty responding in their behavior. Another very important thing to know about INFJs is they have a very high level of introverted intuition. If you don't know what that is, introverted intuition is the kind of mind's way of looking at the future, looking at their future. So any INFJ would have a lot more hope towards the future than a lot of types that might mistype as INFJs. They're looking towards their future, not just general future, not metaphysical or philosophical things. That's too vague. But they're really looking at their future. They're looking at what can I do, what could I do, what will I do, what would I do. And they're trying to play out different potentials in their future. Okay, if I make these choices, I could do this. If I make these choices, this could happen in my future, and I could do this. And this is who I could be. And Hero is all about finding its own kind of character, who it wants to be, who it wants to become, its ideal self. And so that's something to be aware of. If you are an INFJ, you're going to definitely focus on your own character, who you want to be. Another very common thing that INFJs have is they have super pessimistic feeling in general, but especially their FI critic. Their FI critic is double pessimistic, it's fully pessimistic, it's extremely pessimistic, however you want to describe it. So that means they're really not fond of having their own values too much. They're not fond of looking into their feelings, seeing if they feel good about themselves, if they're a good person. They're not really looking to be, same with low SI, they're not looking to do healthy things. They're not looking to do, good things that are good for them. So they're very pessimistic with their good, bad judgments of themselves. And in general, they kind of feel bad. They might be very kind of have a negative self-esteem, very hard on themselves, overly humble to the point of actively, putting themselves down constantly, really belittling their own worth, their own goodness. And that's something that's very kind of obvious for INFJs. Another one, like I was saying, is that lack of SI completely. So they're not looking to feel healthy, feel at peace, feel safe, feel comfortable in their environment. They don't give a crap about any of that. They're just looking to do what they want, and it doesn't matter how much pain or discomfort or insecurity they have to endure. They're just looking to get what they want. They don't care if it makes them feel bad. They don't care if it's hard. They're just going to try their best to ignore their own internal experience, ignore their own internal world. While INFJs do have a lot of intuition and a lot of gut, and they can be very introspective, they might not always have the most, imaginative internal world in an ideal state. Maybe if they're really shadow focused and they're in a negative headspace, they will. But in an ideal healthy sense, they're not going to focus too much on themselves because they have pessimistic FI and pessimistic SI. They're not going to want to look at their past. They're not going to want to kind of go into their own feelings and have their own, principles that are super core to them. That's just a secondary version of themselves. That's not going to happen very likely in a primary version. Another thing that INFJs do, they have FE and SE in their ego. And so they're always judging other people's character, other people's, who is that person, who has that person been before. So they're looking at other people's past, they're looking at other people's actions, They're trying to examine how consistent other people are, if their actions line up with their words. They're trying to see how good other people are, what values other people have. And they're not necessarily doing it from a sense of all people's values are wrong. They're kind of balanced. So they'll see people who are good and give them credit, and they'll also see people who are bad, and they'll kind of notice when other people are doing bad things. So they're very aware of, the goodness and the badness of other people. Some other kind of common INFJ traits, they struggle with rejection. They have SC aspirational. So they struggle with that feeling of being alone, being rejected. When they want something, they want somebody, they're pursuing someone. For that person to not let them into their life is really hard for them. And they can struggle with all that rejection, all that failure, whenever they're performing, whenever they're trying really hard. That's very difficult for them to deal with. And really, it's super difficult as well because it puts them in their SI. It reminds them that they're alone. It reminds them that they don't have anyone in their life. And this can lead to boredom, hedonism, because if they have, no SI basically, except for a very small negative awareness of SI, they're going to overindulge. They're going to, feel like either I need to get out of my own experience or I'm going to overindulge in order to give myself a good experience, but it's just not really the right way to go. While SI users will feel healthy and feel happy, potentially, if they're FI users, An SI user might feel healthy, whereas an INFJ probably won't feel healthy very easily. So they're either going to kind of ignore their health or they're going to hurt their health on an average. Of course, it depends on how mature a person is. Another thing that we talked about before is that high level of decision making, the high level of intention. They do have NI hero. They're very, very intentional. If you ask them why they did something, they're going to say why they chose that. They're going to explain their decision. They're going to explain why they did something in that way. They're going to understand, with their TI as well, they're going to understand why they made a choice and why they wanted something, why they want something in the future, what they're going to want. So if they're very, very kind of hopeful about their future, then you can kind of tell where their NI might be. Another thing they really want to do is make others entertained, make others laugh. They like to tell witty, quick, direct jokes, make others laugh, say stuff that's funny. They're always going to be looking at other people, seeing if they're paying attention, seeing if other people are having a good experience. So they're not just going to be in their internal world and kind of being themselves. They're going to be looking around. They're going to be trying to entertain when they're being extroverted, and they're going to kind of generally try to connect with other people. So they can be quite extroverted when they're in an extroverted situation. So let's look at the common kind of mistypings, the common kind of types that are close. If you're kind of like, I'm not sure, I'm probably between these different types, but which one am I? That's super common. It's really hard to know. And let's look at the most common one, or at least one of the most common ones in my opinion, the INFP versus INFJ. So which one are you? It's an extremely common mistype, mainly due to test problems, because technically INFPs are INFJs and vice versa when it comes to letters and their connection to the functions. I have another video on that if you want to know more about that and about how tests kind of are inaccurate. But some of the things we talked about before are some of the main differences. So there's a difference in feeling expression. While INFPs have FI hero, they like to have their own feelings. They feel good. They feel better than other people. They feel like they're a good person. They have principles. They have morals, that they're important, that they're special. And INFJ feels the opposite. They feel unimportant, unspecial. They feel worthless. They feel bad about themselves. They don't feel at all that they're a good person or that they're important or special at all, like I said. So that's a pretty big difference in kind of how they feel. And then a very difference in intuition expression. While INFPs have NI critic, and they're going to think poorly about their own future. They're going to be hopeless. They're not going to want to try unless it's a guarantee. They're not going to want to go out of their comfort zone. They're not going to want to do new things. INFJs love doing new things, new kind of choices, new potentials. They're going to want to explore these and kind of progress. And INFJs are always looking to kind of go towards their ideal future, do what they hope to do what they want to do. So it's quite a big difference between the kind of despair of an INFP and the kind of hopeful disposition of an INFJ. So yeah, in general, these types are very different personalities. They have the complete opposite functions. It's something to kind of be aware of. Another kind of perspective with that is the TI versus TE difference. So an INFP has TE. They really care about being popular. They care about being cool. They care about being respected. They care about, their beliefs. What do they believe? To an INFP, whatever they believe is the truth, whereas to an INFJ, it's the opposite. To an INFJ, only the truth is the truth, and they don't even really care what they believe. So INFJs are much more focused on that kind of objective perspective, whereas INFPs are much more subjective in that way. So there's quite a lot of differences. I could probably do a whole video just on these ones. we're going to move on to another very common mistyping, ENFP versus INFJ. And while these types are a little more similar in a lot of ways, they're still quite different, of course, because they still have complete opposite functions. So yeah, this one has to do with a lot of the fact that they have the shadow of the other type. So an ENFP's shadow is an INFJ, and an INFJ's shadow functions are in the order of an ENFP. So they can be very similar, and that's why a lot of people will mistype. But there's quite a big difference in how their ego expresses themselves, right? So like we talked about before, of the differences between an INFP and an INFJ, a lot of those are very similar. An ENFP will have a lot more feelings, but they'll be more mixed. They'll have different moods. They'll be really happy and then really sad, and they can fluctuate with their moods. But overall, an ENFP is going to be much more going towards the abstract, the imaginative. They're going to focus a lot on their inner world, whereas an INFJ is going to focus so much on their external world. They're going to want to be impacting others, making others laugh, making others happy, whereas an ENFP is very, very actually introspective. An ENFP might be the most introverted extrovert, whereas an INFJ is the most extroverted introvert. And so these are kind of some of the ways as well that people can often get these confused, and it can be quite hard to know. My recommendation to really understand the different types are to learn all the functions and how they work, and that will really help you fully identify this. And that kind of internal world, primary versus secondary, right? ENFPs will care more about being desirable. INFJs will care more about being attractive. INFJs want to impact others in the moment. ENFPs don't care about the moment at all. I could go on and on between the differences between these types. ENFPs in general are going to look to kind of find out what other people think, whereas an INFJ is going to be super analytical, super in their head. They're always processing, always going over what they think. I'll say one of the main differences is if you're an INFJ, you know you're always processing what you want, you're processing what you think, whereas an ENFP isn't doing that very much at all. They're really focused on their own feedback. So what experiences have they had? Did they make them happy? Did they make them sad? How do they feel about their past? So those are the kind of opposite ways that they have their internal world. And that can be a good way to kind of differentiate between these types. And then we have ENFJs and INFJs. Another really common mistype, of course. There's a lot of introverted versus extroverted confusion, kind of understanding the differences. Most extroverts think they're introverts. That's very common. It has a misunderstanding with just how we define introvert versus extroverted, unfortunately. So a really common mistyping. And really, the functional pessimism is a big way to tell. You know, ENFJs are very optimistic with how they impact people. They're very optimistic socially, whereas they're more anxious towards their own internal world. Whereas an INFJ might be very, anxious towards the external world. They're anxious about socializing, but they're more optimistic and they're more decisive in their internal world. And that's a really big difference between these types, between ENFJs and INFJs. Another one is ENFJs are control types. They're structure types. They're going to take the lead. They're going to establish a structure. They're going to be in control of things. They're not going to want too much chaos. Whereas an INFJ doesn't really care as much about things being controlled and stagnant. They want chaos. They want progression. They want to pursue their own goals. They want that kind of different perspective. They want to finish things very specifically and see things through to the end. Whereas an ENFJ wants to have structure and control over their life. So that's another big difference between these ones. So how to learn more. If you want to know more about whether or not you're an INFJ and what type you actually are, you can read our free handbook for more information. It is on our site, ontype.ca/handbook. For that one, that's free. You can get that downloaded and you can learn more about these functions and about these attitudes. And through that, you can learn more about your type. We also have an INFJ guide, ontype.ca/INFJ. That goes super in depth if you think you are an INFJ, or even if you're not and you just want to learn about INFJs and just expand your knowledge. It'll be great for that. You can learn how to, if you're in a relationship with an INFJ, you can learn how to make them happier, some of their common kind of experiences. And that's a really in-depth book on INFJs, and it goes through every single little point that there could be, and it really discusses it on a very deep level. You can also go to ontype.ca/advising to get typed or to get advice. If you think you're an INFJ, you think you're another type, and you want to understand it better and understand yourself better, that's a great place to go. So I hope this explained kind of a little bit about INFJs and the different typings that you could be. And if you enjoyed and you want to watch more, then you can subscribe down below as well, and have a great day.